I think the questions around the histories of art and how they're taught in relation specifically to Black and Asian artists' practices is a question which is at the heart of the Black Artists and Modernism project, which I'm currently involved in with Sonia Boyce, David DeBosa, and Susan Locke from Middlesex University. And I think one of the issues that we're investigating in that project, which I think addresses your question, is the way that there's a couple of issues. One is the way that the kind of art historical canon has had silences and exclusions around certain forms of practice. So certain forms of practice are not as visible within the canon as others. And obviously, there's been a lot of work, for example, about feminist art practices or art practices of women artists, who often have not been accorded the same level of visibility as male practices. I think that's been addressed quite extensively, although obviously more work needs to be done. And I think there are many researchers and teachers within the university that are addressing this issue. I think the question of post-coloniality, decoloniality, Black artist practices is another question that needs to be addressed and unpicked. And one of the methodologies that we're using within the BAM project, the Black Artists and Modernism project, is to focus very closely on the actual artworks at the centre of the art history, right? So what I mean by that is, if you look at the way that many Black and Asian artists' practices have been described or written about within art historical work or within museum exhibitions, etc., the focus has often been on the identity of the artist or on the institutional questions around the need for more Black artists or around questions of diversity, around questions of race and racism. And there's been very little scrutiny of the actual artworks and what the artists were actually trying to do within the work. So what the Black Artists and Modern Project is doing is putting the artwork front and centre. And I think that has been the driving methodology, if you like, that both Sonia and myself have been using in this project. So all of the projects we've done have tended to put the artist's work first and foremost before questions of identity. So, for example, the Ghost projects, the focus was on the way that I introduced the ideas that we talked about was actually by having exhibitions of the work so students can come and engage with the work itself, and then have a discussion around the issues by engaging with the work rather than the other way around, by focusing on issues of race and identity and where they come from and questions around diversity, which are important, but which often kind of cloud understanding of what artists actually doing. So I think, to answer your question, one of the areas that I think needs to be addressed, and which I think we are starting to address, is to pay close attention to the actual work and the practices, and saying, what are these practices? How do they relate to wider art practices? So rather than see them as kind of being separate, as a separate category, or as a kind of separate form of practice which has nothing to do with the kind of wider art historical issues, it's now time to kind of look at their practices and see how they're informed by questions of modernism, postmodernism, contemporaneity, etc. So that's kind of what we're trying to do to address those exclusions of the art historical canon.